In 1971, China reclaimed its seat at the United Nations. In 1979, the United Nations went to China and started a 40-year partnership with the most populous country on this planet. 40 years later, what has been achieved? What is in store for the future? Welcome to a very special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from the Assembly Hall in the heart of the UN headquarters here in New York. I'm extremely pleased to be joined by three distinguished panelists. They are Mr. Satya Tripathi, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Head of the United Nations Environment Program New York office. Mr. Peter Du, Director of the Asia and Pacific Division, responsible for political, peace building and peace operations. And last but not least, Dr. Hamid Rashid, Chief of the Development Research of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, we're talking about China, and we have no Chinese guest, and I think that's a very good start because we can look at it from a distance and be more objective. Mr. Tripathi, let me start from you then. Do you have any memory of what it was like 40 years ago when the UN first went to China? Where were you? Do you have any memory of the beginning days of this very special relationship, and any anecdotes, any specific moments you can share with us?
It's a very interesting question because I was 16 years old at that time, and China, of course, was a very important country from the perspective of India, where I was growing up. It's our neighbor, and so there was a lot of understanding about China and how it was growing, and one has seen in the last 4 decades how China has gotten to its rightful place in the world polity. But my understanding of UN and China is quite limited, if you would ask me what I knew 16 years when I was 16 years old.
So when was the first time that you really had to deal with the situation involving China within the UN system, let's say?
Well, I came into the UN in 1998, and I was then part of the peacekeeping operation. I was in the United Nations mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was running the human rights operation there as the head of human rights investigations. And so that's where, of course, China was a leading member of the Security Council at that time. So that was my first interaction when we were submitting our reports to the Council, and China played a very constructive role. The subsequent experience I had was then when I was the head of program and planning for the UN mission in Liberia, where China had sent a contingent of construction engineers who built a lot of the roads in Liberia. So I would say the contributions are not just in terms of resources, but at every level of the way the organization is involved around the world.
Yeah. And nowadays, when you are talking about, when you are having to do with China, what are the major areas of work that you will be talking about?
Well, in terms of climate change, China is a big part of the, if you call it a problem, because as a country, although per capita the carbon footprint is fairly low, but as a country, as one entity, it's the largest emitter.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. But then again, a fair number is the per capita emissions. But then again, coming back to the country and its position in the global system of governance, both in terms of as a permanent member of the Security Council, but more importantly, in terms of its size and complexity and reach and geographical spread. China plays a massive role, and thankfully a constructive role at this time, in dealing with the challenge of climate change. And of course, we don't have enough time for me to talk about it, but China has, if you can pick up hundreds of examples of in terms of the way China has greened different areas within the country.
With India. Together with India.
Yes. So I think there's a lot to talk about, and thankfully all positive.
Great, great. It's a very good starting point for our program. I was getting a little bit worried when you say problem, but then it's true, you know, that's the thing about China. I mean, we are big, we have developed so fast, and we have also a lot of problems on the way of development. I would go back to climate change in just a moment, but let me turn to Mr. Du and ask you about peacekeeping, peace building operations and stuff like that. When was the first time that you had to deal with China in your current sphere of work?
So I've been with the UN for 25 years or so, and I started encountering Chinese peacekeepers, I would say probably almost 25 years ago, in the field, and the numbers have then only increased. We're marking 40 years of a UN presence in China, but I think next year we'll mark 30 years of China's contributions to UN peacekeeping. And they started up being quite modest in the early 90s, but then they grew. And over the past 10 years, they've grown very significantly. So there are now 2,500 Chinese military and police. That is the 11th highest of all contributors, but in fact, if you look just at the permanent 5 members of the Council, it is by far the largest contributor to peacekeeping. And Chinese military and police, men and women, are present throughout our operations. There are 14 across the globe. They are in some hotspots also in Africa and the Middle East. It's a contribution we very much appreciate because of the high quality, well-trained troops. And also the fact that China over the years has expanded its contributions. Initially it was sort of medical engineering. Now there are also combat troops, highly specialized units. So very valuable contributions from China. Maybe beyond the peacekeeping, sort of more on the political side, and as a member, a permanent member of the Security Council, China has a key role in terms of maintaining international peace and security. And you have done so consistently over many years. Have always tried to play a constructive role in the Council. You have not used your veto that much. And I think China, and our Secretary General has said this, is really a pillar of international cooperation and multilateralism. I think the world right now is going through a phase where sometimes multilateralism is a bit under threat. Nationalism is rising here and there, a bit of populism. Council at times is divided. But China is trying to promote the role of the UN and the Security Council. And in fact, just to flag another anniversary, next year will be the 75th anniversary of the UN.
Yes.
And a key theme will be multilateralism. And I think the title is reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism. And China is very much pursuing the same agenda, so we appreciate that.
Wow. So very positive so far. Is there a problem somewhere here and there? Can you...
Let me just highlight too. So on peacekeeping, I think China has some concerns as well about the fact that some of our operations have become very dangerous. China has had casualties over the years, so there's a bit of a debate, but China is contributing to that, about how best to do peacekeeping. And then just on the Security Council, I think we all know how divided it is at the moment on some key international issues. But that's of course for the Security Council itself to try to sort out.
So it's not a uniquely Chinese problem,
no.
Fortunately for now. But Dr. Rashid, let me go to you.
Sure.
Share with us your memory about your first encounter as a UN functionaire about China.
First, when I came to the UN, and as an economist working at the UN, I saw that this growth story of China's success story is an inspiration for the developing country in general. And if you look at what China has been able to achieve, of course, there are some costs, environmental costs that we talked about, but no country has been able to achieve that spectacular growth for such a long period of time. Reducing the poverty rate from 88% in 1980 to less than 1% today. You're talking about reducing that number of people living in poverty by 850 million. This is the global contribution. We couldn't achieve the MDGs. One of the critical goal MDGs was reducing poverty by half.
The Millennium Development Goals. Yeah.
And China was the largest contributor to the MDGs. So in terms of reducing poverty, because without China's contribution, China's effort in poverty reduction, the world would have been in a much darker place today. So I think my as an economist, as a development economist, I follow China very carefully and very with a lot of enthusiasm, because I think that's a story that needs to be told to the world, and I think that's where many countries can follow China's growth strategy to see how best we can lift the people, because as you know, UN has this objective of leaving no one behind. I think China's story is about leaving no one behind, and have been able to lift so many people out of the poverty line. And I think this is where we see as the UN, learning from the Chinese experience and spreading that knowledge to the rest of the world.
Is that also a completely positive story, or there are also lessons to be taken, to be learned from this decades of double-digit growth? Of course, now it kind of slowed down to 6%, around 6%, 6.5%. What would be the biggest lesson in your eyes?
I think the slowing down of the growth is a natural process. No country can grow a double-digit for, even the fact that China grew for 40 years, 30 years at double-digit rate is a miracle in itself. But the natural process, as the economy grows larger, the pie gets larger, the growth rate slows down. If you look at the OECD countries, they grow on average 3%. So that's a natural transition. I think the risk for growth is coming from a different side, rising inequality. I think this is a global phenomenon, and China has been doing better than many countries, but still it has not been able to stem the rise of inequality. And if you look at the China's challenge going forward with avoiding the middle income trap, the trap that many middle income countries, it's very easy to rise from low income to the middle income status. From middle income to high income, it becomes much harder. And there, inequality can be a stumbling block. So taming inequality would be a big challenge for China, like it has been a big challenge for many developing countries in Latin America, and they have not been able to reduce inequality.
Let's not lose sight of the theme of our discussion, which is the United Nations and China, 40 years of this partnership. So how has this relationship evolved? Maybe we start from there, because it has been an interesting trajectory, right? China was then the recipient of international aid, of capacity building and all of that. And now China's position seems to have changed because its strengths have grown. So, Mr. Tripathi, from your observation, how has this partnership evolved?
Well, from an environmental and climate perspective, let me focus on that. We have seen that it is possible to regenerate nature. From massive examples in Inner Mongolia and other parts of China, we have seen that it is not an imaginary construct, that you can indeed, within limited amount of time, get back nature to its pristine glory. And so that's, I think, something very encouraging for rest of the world that are trying to do something similar.
Well, before you go on, I must say it is quite amazing that you can actually change the weather as if you have, a tuna in. But it does happen. I mean, anybody who has been in Beijing, for instance, over the past few years, you would notice the incredible improvement in air quality. But what do you think has made it possible? And what role has UN played in that?
I think the UN has played a very constructive role in engaging different stakeholders in China, not just the government. And that has played a very significantly positive, made a significantly positive contribution to what has been achieved in China. In terms of resources, in terms of the work itself, of course it is China and the government in the lead, but in terms of ideas and in terms of lessons learned from around the world, I think the UN has played a huge role in bringing that to China. And so much so that now China is giving back to the rest of the world. Climate change is anthropogenic, which is, in simple terms, man-made. So if human behavior can be regulated, you can actually turn back all the damage that has happened to the climate. So it is about humans. I often say this, that the climate change problem exists because of three reasons. A, arrogance, because we somehow believe that nature exists for us, whereas we are only one of the 8 million species that inhabits the earth. The second is ignorance. We refuse to educate ourselves on the tremendous challenge that confronts humanity, not just China, the rest of the world. China will be a big victim if it comes to that. If we get to this 1.5 degree scenario, or the 2 degree scenario, or the Paris Agreement pathway, which is 3.2 degree scenario. So the ignorance is confounding, that we refuse to educate ourselves on the perils and also on the positive aspects of what we can actually do. And the third is refusal to act. And that's where I think China stands out as a positive example of not just people and the stakeholders, but the government taking a lead role in bringing about these system scale changes in different parts of the country.
So basically you're talking about China being somewhat reluctant to act on climate change, to reining its greenhouse gas emissions because of its priority on development, to being more and more active because it itself sees the need from a self-interest perspective. Mr. Du, from the peace building and peace operations perspective, how has this relationship been shifting? You talked about 25 years ago, right? China already started sending in, but now China, as you said, is one of the biggest contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. Has the nature of this partnership or this contribution changed?
Yes, absolutely. I think in general the UN used to give a lot to China and we got less, but right now it's very much us who are receiving your support. And I don't think it's been mentioned yet, you're now the second largest contributor to the UN budget, and besides that China makes significant voluntary contributions to the UN, also to our peace building work, our political work. And beyond that, when I now go to China, I was there a few months ago, I don't focus on what's happening in China. I focus on China's role in the region and in the world. And that's where you politically, diplomatically have very much stepped up as you have grown, as you have opened up and reformed. And you are now a key actor in many hotspots around the world. So when I'm in China, in Beijing, I discuss, for example, the situation in Afghanistan or Myanmar or DPRK, the Korean Peninsula. And on many of these issues, we have a very close partnership, and China is playing a very constructive role. Gradually, that's also being recognized if you look at the UN leadership. So we now have, for example, a Chinese gentleman who's a special envoy for the Great Lakes. And that shows that it's also being recognized now that China has leaders who are good mediators, good diplomats. And we've had force commanders in our peacekeeping operations who are Chinese. So we're receiving more and more from you in terms of expertise. And
Dr. Rashid, from the economic point of view.
Yeah, I think when you talk about Chinese contribution, we have to look at the tangible and intangible. I think intangible contributions are the Chinese development experience, and we, in our department, we have been able to bring many, policy makers and also the mid-level officials to China to learn about how they did it. What are the strategies that they followed in terms of pursuing the development framework, and China's 5-year plans, how they're implemented, what are the coordination mechanisms in place. I think these are extremely valuable, intangible development experiences that can be very helpful for the global. You cannot put a dollar value to those experiences because sometimes knowledge is very, non-quantifiable. So I think from that point of view, China's contribution has grown tremendously. And if you look at one of the initiatives that China has taken, the Belt and Road Initiative, which we have been studying from our department quite extensively, this has a lot of positive spillovers. It is creating a huge amount of opportunities, economic opportunities in many countries that had very large savings investment gap, meaning that they didn't have enough domestic savings, and they were not able to attract foreign investment in that scale to have domestic investments. And China is stepping in to meet those gaps, and I think that is creating huge infrastructure opportunities because ultimately it's about connectivity, access to the markets, and many countries. I've been working in some of the countries in Central Asia, and I've been talking to them about their cooperation with China. They're tremendously grateful in terms of what's happening with the Belt and Road, in terms of getting new access to the markets in Europe and markets to China. So they see themselves as the bridge between Europe and Asia, and China is building that bridge for them. So I think that's where the win-win outcomes lie. Yeah.
I do want to hear what are your expectations, going forward? What would be expected of China within the UN system, and what does China have to do, starting from today, on top of what it has done, in order to be a bigger contributor? So what is expected of China? What does China have to do more and better?
I think I'll make a very simple but a very significant point. Worldwide, built infrastructure has always come at the expense of ecological infrastructure. Without exception, there are no exceptions to this rule. Wherever there has been built infrastructure, it has decimated ecological infrastructure, and that is why we are where we are today. But at that time, when it was happening, it was not clearly known. The science was not available. Now the science is established. We didn't have the economic metrics and the interrelationships. Now we know, and we also have the tools. So whether it is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive effort to bring about built infrastructure to underserved regions, which is very laudable, but at the same time, not to lose sight of the fact that every bit of built infrastructure will demand its share in terms of, that's the counterbalancing. So how do we save our ecological infrastructure, which is becoming more and more urgent at this time? We need to turn the tide on the climate challenge within the next 10 years. And that's the biggest question.
Is there a mechanism in place for the UN and China to work together? Because the UN also recognized, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative has a great potential for socio-economic development. So is there something being done to mitigate the negative ecological and environmental impacts?
No, absolutely. I think almost every agency of the UN is working with China on the BRI, and in terms of greening the BRI, in terms of working together to in an impartial, unbiased manner, study the impacts or potential impacts and put it out in the public domain so that all parties are in full knowledge of what is the possible outcome, and then make their decisions in a conscientious manner. And I think China very much welcomes that. Another example I'll cite to you is that everybody talks about the climate challenge and what needs to be done. Very few people talk about the resources. Where will the money come from? And one of the tools has been green bonds. If you take the case of China, in 5 years ago, the green bonds market was zero, literally zero.
Okay.
And now it's, I might be wrong, because last time I checked it was in the range of $600 billion within 3.5 years. They started around 2016.
Wow.
And so China has that scale which can actually tilt the balance for the positive.
So you are
we
expecting...
need to focus, absolutely. So that's my expectation, that China will continue to play the hugely positive role it has in different, because climate change is a puzzle, you know, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and you need to deal with each of those pieces. You can't just say, okay, I plant a bunch of trees, that will solve the problem. No, it's about trees, it's about water, it's about air, it's about use of our natural resources in a sustainable manner. So it's a whole lot of things that has to happen in sync. And China has both the knowledge resources and the material resources to protect its natural resources for itself and for the planet.
And I think China has that will. At this
I see that. I see that in a very strong way. Yes.
We hope that that gets implemented. Dr. Rashid, you want to add in?
No, I think what Mr. Tripathi just mentioned, that everything has a cost. There's no free lunch, and infrastructure projects often have a very high environmental cost, even social cost. But what we're doing in the department as a part of the UN, when you're looking at the BRI projects, we run different simulations, different scenarios, and try to look at all the costs and how do you mitigate or compensate some of the cost. Or it's not always that you have to accept all the cost. It's possible to reduce some of the cost in a way that is like have more win-win outcome. Because as Mr. Tripathi mentioned earlier, that there's a huge inequality in emission. So if you tell a developing country that you can't pursue a development pathway because that will add more emission, that will not be acceptable. So, but we have to find a way where there's some kind of convergence over time. Developing countries can catch up, but at the same time they reduce the footprint. And again, the new research is showing that green economy, you don't have to have a trade-off. Actually, green economy can be, even 10 years back, the idea was that if you green your economy, it'll destroy jobs, it will destroy opportunities. But now, green economy is creating more jobs than before.
Yeah, I think Chinese President Xi Jinping has been repeating this, saying that a good environment is a gold mine. He tries to drive that into the head of people. Let's see how well that's implemented on different levels. In terms of, again, peace building and peace operations, what will be the expectation of China, and what is the commitment from your understanding from China to help contribute even more?
China is already playing a very important role as regards peace and security. Of course, we can always hope for even more, so we could hope for even greater Chinese contributions, for example, to peacekeeping. If you look at the even higher level, and going back to sort of multilateralism and international cooperation, if China can help rally not only Asia but the whole world around the UN, around international cooperation, around the importance of a multilateral approach to the many challenges we face on the development side, on the peace and security side. That is a key role, which you are already doing, but we hope you can do that even more as we move ahead, and also to our anniversary, 75 years next year.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of the program, almost running out of time, but I do want to ask, is there anything that I have not asked, but you think it's very important to mention when it comes to China's relationship with the United Nations? Yes, Dr. Rashid.
I think my colleagues mentioned that multilateralism is facing some serious challenge, and we need new champions for multilateralism. And the hopes, people are looking at China right now to fill some of the leadership vacuums that are emerging. So we are going towards probably another sort of multipolar world, but leadership will be very critical, and the countries need to restore their faith and trust in the multilateral system, and the leaders would actually lead the way in terms of other countries following. And I think this is where I see China's big role in the coming years.
Right. And you would
well, the climate challenge is the most defining challenge of our times. We will all see it in our lifetimes. We have seen the damage. It is only getting worse. And now you look at this tornado, that typhoon, that cyclone, or this drought or the flood, they are becoming so common. Earlier, you would hear about these things once every few years. Now they are happening with such an alarming regularity that it's becoming a trend now. So my suggestion is that it is too big a problem for any one country or one region to deal with. It is a common problem of humanity.
Yes.
And it cannot be resolved in a way it needs to without the support and leadership of countries like China. Because countries like China are so big and so important in the overall scheme of things that without their positive and meaningful contributions, whatever the rest of the world does actually won't matter. So that's how big China is.
Wow.
Because it's anthropogenic climate change. You have 1/6 of the population there.
Okay.
So China has to play a hugely important role in this whole climate conversation.
Mr. Du?
Just a point that may sound small, but I think it's important, and that's youth. That China, being such a big population and having so many young people, needs to engage its youth. And I think youth is important in terms of promoting the UN agenda of multilateralism, but youth is also important in terms of peace and security. And I've been very encouraged by the fact that China has focused very much on this agenda of youth. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have
Thank
to
you.
wrap it there. I think a lot of expectations, a lot of responsibilities, a lot of pressure for China, but I think China can't hide from all of these. We have to be more responsible as we become stronger. And with that, we are going to wrap up this very special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from the heart of the UN here in New York. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thank you very much for having followed us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.